She had been cleaning that house for 30 years, and in 30 years, not once had anyone said her name correctly. Her name was Concetta Maria Ferraro. It was an Italian name given to her by her grandmother in Naples before the family came to America, and it meant pure and conceived, and it was a name that carried weight and history, and the kind of old-world dignity that doesn't translate well into the marble hallways of a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. But they called her Connie, or the Help, or most often, nothing at all. They spoke about her in the third person while she was standing in the room as if she were a piece of furniture. Has the maid done the upstairs yet? Tell her to use the other polish on the silver. Make sure she doesn't forget the guest bathroom this time. 30 years of she and her and the maid. 30 years of being erased in her own workplace, reduced to a function, a pair of hands that scrubbed and polished and folded and pressed and never, ever complained. Concetta was 58 years old. She was short and sturdy, built like the women in her family had always been built, with strong arms and thick wrists and hands that had been rough since childhood. Her hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a bun that she pinned every morning at 4:30 before the sun came up, before the bus that took her from her small apartment in Bridgeport to the Sinclair estate in Greenwich. The bus ride was an hour and 12 minutes each way. She had taken that bus 6 days a week for 30 years. She could calculate it in her sleep. Roughly 18,000 round trips, roughly 43,000 hours on a bus, roughly 5 years of her life spent in a vinyl seat, watching the Connecticut landscape roll past the window, going to and from a house that would never be hers. She had started at the Sinclairs in 1994 when she was 28 years old and newly arrived from Italy with a work visa, suitcase, and a determination that could have powered a small city. Her English was broken then, barely functional, assembled from television reruns and a pocket dictionary she carried everywhere. She had answered an ad in the newspaper, handwritten and photocopied, posted on the bulletin board at St. Michael's Church in Bridgeport. Housekeeper needed, large home in Greenwich. Must be reliable, discreet, and experienced. References required. She had no references. She had no experience, unless you counted keeping her grandmother's apartment spotless in Naples, which she did. She took the bus to Greenwich, walked 2 miles from the bus stop because she didn't know there was a closer one, arrived at the front door of the Sinclair estate sweating through her best blouse, and rang the bell. Victoria Sinclair opened the door. She was 35 years old then. Tall and blonde and immaculate in the way that only women with unlimited money and unlimited time can be immaculate. Her nails were perfect. Her hair was perfect. Her teeth were perfect. She looked at Concetta the way a jeweler looks at a stone that might or might not be worth polishing. "You're the one who called about the position?" "Yes, ma'am. I am Concetta Ferraro. I am very hard worker." Victoria's eyes traveled from Concetta's scuffed shoes to her sweating forehead to her rough hands, and something settled in her expression. Not approval, not warmth, something colder. The satisfaction of finding exactly what she was looking for. Not a person, a tool. "You'll start Monday, 6 days a week, 6 in the morning to 6 at night. You'll clean, cook when needed, do laundry, manage the pantry, and handle any other household tasks that arise. You will not use the front entrance. The service door is around the back. You will not eat in the dining room. There is a chair in the kitchen. You will address me as Mrs. Sinclair, my husband as Mr. Sinclair, my children by their first names. Is that clear?" It was clear. It was humiliating. And it was demeaning, and it was the kind of arrangement that a different woman, a woman with more options, would have walked away from on the spot. But Concetta did not have more options. She had a work visa that was tied to employment. She had rent due in 2 weeks. She had a grandmother in Naples who needed medication that cost more than her pension. She had the kind of no choice that looks like a choice from the outside, but feels like a trap from the inside. Yes, Mrs. Sinclair, very clear. She started Monday. The Sinclair estate was not a house. It was a statement. 12,000 square feet of Georgian architecture set on 4 acres of manicured grounds, 7 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows and first edition books that nobody read, a formal dining room with a table that seated 24, used maybe 3 times a year, a kitchen the size of Conchetta's entire apartment, with marble countertops and copper pots and a sub-zero refrigerator that was always full of food that was always going to waste. The house had been built by Victoria's father-in-law, Richard Sinclair Sr., who had made his fortune in commercial real estate in the 1960s. He had built it as a monument to his success, a brick-and-mortar declaration that the Sinclairs had arrived and intended to stay. When he died in 1988, the house passed to his son, Richard Jr., who married Victoria in 1990 and who, in Conchetta's assessment, was a decent man trapped in an indecent marriage. Richard Jr. was quiet, reserved. He worked in the family business because it was expected of him, not because it inspired him. He wore expensive suits the way some men wear armor, as protection against a world that expected certain things of him that he wasn't sure he could deliver. He drank too much at dinner parties and laughed too loud at his own jokes and had the hollow, distracted air of a man who had woken up one day in a life that didn't belong to him and couldn't figure out how to get out. He was kind to Conchetta, not aggressively kind, not performatively kind. Just quietly, consistently kind in the small ways that mattered. He said good morning to her. He thanked her when she brought him coffee. He asked about her grandmother once after overhearing a phone call, and when Conchetta told him about the medication costs, he slipped an envelope under the kitchen door the next morning with enough cash to cover 3 months of prescriptions. He never mentioned it again. She never forgot it. Victoria, on the other hand, was a different kind of person entirely. Victoria Sinclair was not cruel in the way that villains in movies are cruel. She didn't scream or throw things or make threats. Her cruelty was colder than that, more refined. It was the cruelty of indifference, the cruelty of treating another human being as if they existed only to serve you, as if their inner life, their feelings, their history, their pain were irrelevant. It was the cruelty of never saying please, of never saying thank you, of leaving a dress on the bathroom floor and expecting it to be picked up, cleaned, pressed, and returned to the closet by the time she came home, without ever acknowledging that a human being had done the work. It was the cruelty of the Christmas bonus. Every year, on December 23rd, Victoria would leave an envelope on the kitchen counter with a card that said "Season's Greetings" and a check for $200. $200 for a year of 6-day weeks, 12-hour days, and the kind of physical labor that left Conchetta's knees aching and her back screaming every night when she finally collapsed into her bed in Bridgeport. $200. After 30 years, the amount never changed. Not for inflation, not for loyalty, not for the fact that Conchetta had raised Victoria's 3 children more than Victoria had, because that was the other thing. The thing that made Conchetta's relationship with the Sinclair family complicated in a way that no paycheck could untangle. She had raised those children. Charlotte, the eldest, had been 3 years old when Conchetta started, a tiny, serious girl with her father's eyes and her mother's chin, who followed Conchetta around the house like a shadow and asked her questions about Italy and food and why the sky was blue. Conchetta had taught Charlotte to tie her shoes. She had packed her lunches for school. She had braided her hair every morning for 6 years until Charlotte decided she was too old for braids. She had held Charlotte when she cried about a boy in 7th grade who said her ears were too big. She had stayed late, unpaid, when Charlotte had the flu and Victoria was at a spa weekend in the Berkshires. Then there was James, the middle child, who was born the year after Conchetta started and who, from the moment he could walk, gravitated toward her like a plant toward sunlight. James was sensitive and creative and everything that the Sinclair family wasn't built to nurture. He drew pictures and made up stories and cried at movies and once brought home a wounded bird and begged Conchetta to help him save it. She did. They made a nest out of a shoebox and cotton balls and kept it in the laundry room for 2 weeks until the bird was strong enough to fly. When James released it in the garden, he turned to Conchetta and hugged her with the fierce, trusting grip of a child who knows exactly who loves him. And then there was Elizabeth, the youngest, born when Conchetta was 35, delivered by emergency C-section while Victoria was sedated and Richard was stuck in traffic on I-95. Conchetta was the first person to hold Elizabeth. The nurse had put the baby in her arms while they waited for the parents, and Conchetta had looked down at that tiny, red, screaming face and felt something that she had no right to feel, but felt anyway. She loved those children, not as a substitute mother, not as a replacement for what Victoria should have been, but as the woman who was there every day for everything. The scraped knees and the nightmares and the school projects and the broken hearts and the 1,000 invisible crises that make up a childhood. She was there for all of it. Victoria was there for the photographs. The children grew up the way children do in houses where love comes from unexpected places. They learned early that their mother was someone to be managed, not confided in. That their father was kind but absent, physically present but emotionally somewhere else, behind a wall of whiskey and obligation. And that the woman who actually cared, the woman who actually showed up, the woman who would sit on the floor with them at midnight when the thunderstorm was too loud and the shadows on the wall were too scary, was the one who came through the service door. Charlotte, the eldest, figured this out first. She was 8 years old when she came home from school one day, crying because a girl in her class had told everyone that Charlotte's family had a maid, and she had said it the way you say someone has lice. Something embarrassing, something shameful. Charlotte ran straight past her mother, who was on the phone in the living room, and went to the kitchen, where Conchetta was preparing dinner. She threw her arms around Conchetta's waist and cried into her apron, "Am I a bad person because we have a maid?" Conchetta knelt down and wiped Charlotte's tears with her thumbs. She looked her in the eyes and said, "Having someone help you is not bad. Treating them like they are nothing is bad. You never treat me like nothing. You treat me like someone. That's all that matters." Charlotte never forgot those words. 25 years later, as a corporate lawyer negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, she would sometimes catch herself in a meeting and think about what Conchetta had said, and it would recalibrate something inside her. It would remind her that the way you treat the people who serve you is the truest measure of who you are. James was different. James didn't need Conchetta to explain things. He understood instinctively from a very young age that the hierarchy in his house was wrong, that the woman who cooked their food and washed their clothes and held them when they were sick was more important than the woman who signed the checks and attended the galas and smiled for the cameras. He expressed this understanding the way creative children do, not with words but with art. He drew pictures of Conchetta, hundreds of them, in every medium: crayon, pencil, watercolor, charcoal. He drew her hands, her face, her profile against the kitchen window. He drew her the way a Renaissance painter draws a saint, with reverence and light, and the understanding that holiness lives in ordinary places. Victoria found the drawings once. She found them in a shoebox under James's bed, a collection of portraits of the maid rendered with more care and attention than anything James had ever drawn of his own family. Victoria took the shoebox and threw it in the trash. She never said a word about it. James found out. He didn't cry. He didn't confront his mother. He went to the kitchen and told Conchetta what had happened. Conchetta hugged him and said, "Draw more. They can throw away the paper. They can't throw away what's in your head." He drew more. He never stopped drawing. Elizabeth, the youngest, was the one who broke the rules most openly. When she was 12, she invited Conchetta to eat with the family on Thanksgiving. Not serve dinner, eat dinner at the table, in a chair, like a person. Victoria's reaction was swift and devastating. She sent Elizabeth to her room without dinner. She fired the words at Conchetta like bullets. "You are the help. You eat in the kitchen. You do not sit at my table. This is not a discussion." And she turned to Richard Jr., who was standing in the doorway, holding a bottle of wine, and said, "Control your daughter, or I will." Richard said nothing. He looked at Conchetta. He looked at the floor, and he went back to the library to pour himself another drink. Conchetta ate in the kitchen, alone. The turkey she had spent 2 days preparing, the stuffing made from her grandmother's recipe, the cranberry sauce she had cooked from scratch because Charlotte didn't like the canned kind. She ate it all alone at the small table by the refrigerator, while the family she had raised sat in the dining room 20 feet away. Elizabeth came down at midnight. She found Conchetta cleaning the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She just picked up a towel and started drying dishes. They worked side by side in silence for 20 minutes, and it was the most honest conversation either of them had that day. Charlotte went to Yale and became a corporate lawyer in Manhattan and visited twice a year at Thanksgiving and Easter, and each time she hugged Conchetta tighter and longer than she hugged her own mother. James went to art school against his father's wishes and moved to Portland and became a photographer whose work was shown in galleries that his family never visited. Elizabeth went to Brown and then to medical school and then to a residency in pediatrics in Boston. And every Sunday evening she called Conchetta, not her mother, to talk about her week. The children loved Conchetta. Victoria knew it, and she never forgave either of them for it. The resentment was subtle at first, a comment here and there. I see Conchetta is your favorite person again. Perhaps you should ask Conchetta to sign your permission slip, since she seems to be running this household. I'm sure Conchetta would love to attend your graduation, but we only have 4 tickets. Then it became less subtle. Victoria started assigning Conchetta tasks that were deliberately humiliating. Cleaning the toilets during dinner parties so she would be on her knees with a brush while guests in evening wear walked past the bathroom door. Polishing the silver at the dining table while the family ate lunch 3 feet away, as if she were a piece of the scenery. Sending her to the store for items that Victoria didn't need just to make her walk in the rain. Making her re-iron shirts that were already perfectly pressed just to prove that she could make Conchetta do it again. There was one incident that Conchetta never told the children about. It happened in 2010, 16 years into her employment. Victoria was hosting a garden party for the Greenwich Women's Auxiliary. 50 women in sun hats and linen dresses, drinking champagne on the lawn that Conchetta had mowed at 5 that morning. Conchetta was carrying a tray of appetizers through the crowd when Victoria stopped her, in front of everyone, in front of 50 women with champagne flutes and judgmental eyes. "Connie, your shoes are dirty. You're tracking mud on the flagstones. Go inside and clean them before you come back out." Conchetta looked down. Her shoes were not dirty. The flagstones were not muddy. It was a beautiful, dry June afternoon, and there wasn't a speck of mud anywhere. But that wasn't the point. The point was the performance, the demonstration of power, the public reminder of who was in charge and who was not. Conchetta went inside. She stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes. She did not clean her shoes because her shoes did not need cleaning. She stood there and breathed and counted to 65 times, and then she walked back outside with the tray and served the appetizers with the same steady, dignified expression she always wore. One of the women at the party, a quiet, older woman named Helen Marsh, who had been watching the exchange, stopped Conchetta as she passed. "Your shoes are fine, dear," Helen said softly. "I don't know why she did that." "I do," Conchetta said, and she kept walking. Conchetta endured it. She endured it the way she endured everything, with tight lips and straight shoulders and the quiet, ferocious pride of a woman who refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. She endured it because she needed the job, because her grandmother had died in 2003, but by then there was her sister's medical bills and her niece's college tuition and the rent in Bridgeport that kept climbing while her wages barely moved, because the American dream, the one they sold you on television and in magazines, the one that said hard work would be rewarded, had turned out to be a very specific kind of lie. The kind of lie that was true for some people and not for others. And the dividing line between those two groups had nothing to do with how hard you worked and everything to do with which side of the service door you entered through. She endured it for 30 years. And then the Sinclairs went bankrupt. It happened the way these things always happen to wealthy families. Not with a single catastrophic event, but with a slow, invisible bleeding. Richard Jr. had been making bad investments for years, leveraging the family's real estate holdings to finance increasingly risky ventures. A hotel development in Miami that collapsed during a hurricane. A tech startup that burned through $12 million before producing a single product. A partnership with a man who turned out to be running a Ponzi scheme and who vanished to the Cayman Islands with $7 million of Sinclair money. The losses accumulated quietly, hidden behind the facade of the estate, and the Mercedes, and the country club membership, and the Chanel suits. Victoria didn't know. Or rather, Victoria chose not to know. She continued to spend as if the money were infinite, because in her mind, it was. Sinclair money had always been there. It was a force of nature, like gravity or sunlight. It didn't run out until it did. Richard Jr. came home on a Tuesday evening in October and sat Victoria down in the library and told her everything. The debts, the losses, the foreclosure notices, the calls from creditors, the letters from the bank, the reality that they were not just broke, but spectacularly, catastrophically, in debt to the tune of $14 million. Victoria's reaction was not what you might expect. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't throw anything or threaten divorce or collapse into hysterics. She sat in the leather chair by the fireplace and listened with the same expression she wore when Conchetta reported that they were out of Perrier. Mild annoyance, inconvenience, the certainty that this was a problem that would be solved by someone else, because problems were always solved by someone else. So, sell something, she said. Richard looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been trying to explain a fire to someone who doesn't believe in smoke. Victoria, there is nothing left to sell. The cars are leased. The investments are gone. The only asset we have is this house, and the bank is taking it. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. It was the silence of a world ending. Not the actual world, just Victoria's world. The world of Chanel and Hermes and country clubs and charity galas and 12,000 square foot houses that had been built to say, "We have arrived," and that now said, "We are leaving." Victoria did cry then, not for the house, not for the money, not for the children or the future or the years of waste and excess. She cried for herself, for the image of herself that was about to be shattered, for the woman she had constructed out of expensive clothes and perfect nails and the obedience of people she considered beneath her. That woman was about to cease to exist, and Victoria had no idea who she was without her. The bankruptcy proceedings took 8 months. During those 8 months, Conchetta continued to work at the estate. She was not asked to stay. She was not thanked for staying. She stayed because the children asked her to, because Charlotte called her from Manhattan and said, "Please, Conchetta, don't leave them. I know they don't deserve it, but please." And because James sent her an email that said simply, "You're the only real thing in that house. Hold it together for us." So she held it together. She cleaned and cooked and maintained the grounds and managed the increasingly dysfunctional household, while Victoria retreated into a stupor of denial. And Richard Jr. spent his days on the phone with lawyers and accountants, trying to salvage what couldn't be salvaged. The 8 months of bankruptcy were the strangest period of Conchetta's 30 years at the estate. The house was the same. The rooms were the same. The routine was the same. But everything felt different, like looking at a familiar photograph through warped glass. The silence was heavier. The hallways felt longer. The spaces between rooms, spaces she had crossed 1,000,000 times without thinking, suddenly felt vast and uncertain, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the end. Victoria stopped getting dressed most days. She wandered the house in a bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that went cold in her hand, staring at objects as if seeing them for the first time. The Tiffany lamp in the library, the oil painting in the foyer, the crystal chandelier in the dining room. She stared at them the way a drowning person stares at the surface of the water, with the desperate understanding that these things were slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to hold on to them. She spoke to Conchetta exactly once during those 8 months. She came into the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, still in her bathrobe at 3 o'clock, and stood in the doorway and said, "How long have you worked here, Connie?" 30 years, Mrs. Sinclair. Victoria nodded. She looked around the kitchen, at the copper pots, at the marble countertops, at the window above the sink where Conchetta had watched 30 years of seasons change. 30 years, Victoria repeated, and then she turned and walked away. That was it. No apology, no recognition, no moment of clarity or confession or human connection. Just 2 words repeated in a hallway and the sound of slippers on marble. Conchetta hadn't been paid in 3 months when the auction was announced. 3 months without a paycheck. 90 days of showing up at 6 in the morning and leaving at 6 at night and receiving nothing for it, except the knowledge that she was keeping a promise to 3 children who couldn't be there themselves. She dipped into her savings to cover rent and groceries. She didn't resent it. She had been dipping into reserves of one kind or another her entire life. Financial reserves, emotional reserves, the deep underground reservoir of patience and endurance that Italian grandmothers install in their granddaughters like a second spine. The house, the grounds, the furniture, everything was to be sold at public auction to satisfy the outstanding debts. The date was set for a Saturday in June. The listing went up on the auction website with photographs of every room. and Conchetta found herself looking at pictures of places she had cleaned 10,000 times, seeing them the way a stranger would see them, and feeling a strange, dislocating sense of loss. She had hated that house. She had hated the service door and the kitchen chair and the $200 Christmas bonus and the way her name was never spoken correctly. She had hated the hierarchy and the humiliation and the invisible wall between her world and theirs. But she had also loved it. She had loved the way the morning light came through the library windows. She had loved the sound of Charlotte's laughter echoing down the hallway. She had loved the garden that she had maintained for 30 years, pruning the roses and feeding the soil and watching things grow with the patient satisfaction of someone who understands that beauty requires effort. She had loved the kitchen, which was the only room in the house that felt like hers, where she cooked meals that the children loved and Victoria never acknowledged, and Richard Jr. sometimes complimented with a quiet smile. She had poured 30 years of her life into that house, and now it was being sold to the highest bidder. Something happened inside Conchetta in the weeks before the auction, something that had been building for a very long time, so slowly that she hadn't noticed it, the way you don't notice your hair going gray until someone shows you a photograph of yourself from 10 years ago. She got angry, not the hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly and leaves you empty. The cold, structural anger that builds over decades and hardens into something like steel. The anger of a woman who has been undervalued her entire life and has finally decided that the world's assessment of her worth is wrong. She had been saving money since 1994. Every paycheck, every tip, every small windfall. She lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Bridgeport, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator hadn't worked since 2001, and the hallway smelled like somebody else's cooking, and the radiator clanked all night in winter like a prisoner rattling chains. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it cost $470 a month, and it left room for saving. She didn't own a car. She took the bus. She didn't buy expensive clothes. She wore the same 3 outfits to work and the same 2 outfits to church, and she washed them carefully and mended them when they wore thin. She didn't eat at restaurants or take vacations or spend money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. When her shoes wore out, she went to the thrift store. When her coat lost its zipper, she sewed it shut and used buttons instead. When her television broke in 2006, she didn't replace it. She read library books instead. She had a savings account at a bank in Bridgeport that she had opened the month she arrived in America, and she had been depositing money into it with the discipline and the determination of someone building a wall, one brick at a time. She watched the number grow, slowly, painfully slowly, but steadily, year after year, dollar after dollar. The compound interest working in the background like a quiet engine, turning patience into power. She never told anyone how much she had. Not her sister, not her friends at church, not the children. It was her secret, her private defiance. The knowledge that while Victoria spent $1,000 on a handbag, Conchetta was adding another $500 to her account. While Victoria maxed out credit cards on clothes she would wear once, Conchetta was building something that would last. While the Sinclairs were living above their means, the Maid was living below hers, deliberately, strategically, with the long view of a woman who understood that wealth is not what you spend, it's what you keep. In 30 years, she had saved $642,000. It wasn't enough to buy the Sinclair estate at market value. The property had been appraised at $3.2 million. But it was an auction, and auctions are unpredictable, especially auctions of properties with complicated legal histories, outstanding liens, and the kind of toxic reputation that comes from a public bankruptcy. Conchetta called Charlotte. She called James. She called Elizabeth. She told them what she was thinking, not what she was planning, because it wasn't a plan yet. It was an idea, a crazy, impossible, beautiful idea that had been growing in the back of her mind like one of Rose's flowers pushing through frozen soil. Charlotte said, "Are you serious?" James said, "I'll help, whatever you need." Elizabeth said, Do it for all of us." The children pooled their money. Charlotte contributed $200,000 from her savings as a corporate lawyer. James contributed $40,000, which was everything he had. Elizabeth contributed $110,000 from her residency, earnings, and a small inheritance from her maternal grandmother, Victoria's mother, who had left money to the grandchildren, but nothing to Victoria, a detail that spoke volumes about the family dynamics. Together, they had just under $1 million. It still might not be enough, but it might. The auction was held on a Saturday in June. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, warm breeze, the kind of day that real estate agents dream about. The auctioneer set up on the front lawn, and about 40 people showed up, a mix of developers, investors, curious neighbors, and a few people who just wanted to watch the Sinclairs fall. Victoria was not there. She had moved to her sister's house in Westport the week before and had refused to attend. Richard Jr. was there, standing at the back of the crowd in a suit that no longer fit him properly, looking like a man attending his own funeral. Conchetta was there. She stood near the edge of the crowd, wearing a simple blue dress and flat shoes, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to be talked out of it. Charlotte stood beside her in a gray suit, holding a folder with the financial paperwork. James was on the phone from Portland, listening on speaker. Elizabeth was on the phone from Boston, doing the same. The auction began. The opening bid was set at $800,000. A developer from Stamford bid first, $800. A woman from a real estate investment trust bid $850. The developer went to $900. Another bidder, someone on the phone, went to $950. Conchetta's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She had never spent more than $100 on a single purchase in her entire life. She had agonized over a $40 pair of shoes last winter, walking around the store 3 times before deciding they were too expensive. And now she was standing on a lawn in Greenwich, Connecticut, about to spend $1 million. Charlotte leaned over and whispered, "Are you ready?" Conchetta looked at the house. At the windows she had cleaned every month for 30 years. At the garden she had tended. At the service door on the side of the building, the door she had entered through 18,000 times. She thought about her grandmother in Naples, who had worked as a seamstress for 50 years and never owned anything more valuable than a sewing machine. She thought about her mother, who had cleaned offices in Rome at night so Conchetta could go to school during the day. She thought about every woman in her family, going back generations, who had worked and saved and sacrificed and never, not once, been the one holding the keys. She nodded. $1 million, Charlotte said. The crowd went quiet. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when 40 people simultaneously realize that something unexpected is happening. Heads turned. The auctioneer, a bald man in a bow tie who had been doing this for 20 years and thought he had seen everything, paused for a full 3 seconds before repeating the bid. "We have $1 million. $1 million from the lady in gray." The developer from Stamford looked at his partner. They whispered. The partner shook his head. The numbers didn't work. The property needed at least $500,000 in renovations, and at $1 million, the margins were too thin for a flip. The woman from the REIT checked her phone, typing furiously, running calculations, consulting with whoever was on the other end. The man on the phone was silent. $1 million going once, the auctioneer said. The developer shook his head. $1 million going twice. The REIT woman put her phone away. She looked at Charlotte. She looked at Conchetta. Something passed between them, a moment of recognition, woman to woman, that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with understanding. Sold. $1 million. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed across the lawn like a gunshot. Charlotte exhaled so hard that her shoulders dropped 3 inches. James, on the phone from Portland, let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Elizabeth, on the phone from Boston, said a prayer in Spanish that her roommate had taught her. And somewhere in the crowd, Richard Jr. watched the woman who had cleaned his house for 30 years buy it out from under him, and his expression was not anger or resentment or shame. It was relief. The house was going to someone who deserved it. Finally, something in his life had gone to the right person, and Conchetta stood very still, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on the house that she had cleaned for 30 years, the house that had never been hers, the house where she had entered through the service door and eaten in the kitchen and been called the maid and the help, and she and her, and never, Not once, Conchetta. It was hers now. The paperwork took 2 weeks. Charlotte handled the legal details with the precision that made her one of the best corporate lawyers in Manhattan. The title was transferred. The deed was recorded. The keys, all 17 sets of them, were delivered to Conchetta in a cardboard box that she set on the kitchen counter, the same counter where her $200 Christmas bonus had been left every year for 3 decades. She stood in the kitchen and held the keys and cried. Not sad tears, not angry tears. The tears that come when something you have carried for so long, a weight so heavy and so constant that you stopped noticing it, is finally set down. She cried for her grandmother who never lived to see this. She cried for her mother who had cleaned offices so her daughter could have a chance. She cried for the 28-year-old woman who had walked 2 miles from the bus stop in her best blouse and rung the bell and said, "I am very hard worker." She cried for every year of Connie and the help and the maid. She cried because she had won. Not a battle, not a war, something bigger than that. She had won the argument that her entire life had been making since the day she was born. That hard work matters, that dignity cannot be taken, that the woman who enters through the service door and the woman who enters through the front door are the same woman, and the only difference is the door. She moved in on a Friday. She brought her suitcase, the same one she had carried from Italy 34 years ago, now battered and taped and held together by stubbornness. She brought a box of photographs. She brought her grandmother's cookbook. She brought the small wooden crucifix that had hung above her bed in every apartment she had ever rented. She walked through the front door, not the service door, the front door. She walked through the foyer with the marble floors that she had mopped 10,000 times. She walked through the library with the first edition books that nobody read. She walked through the dining room with the table that seated 24. She walked through every room, every hallway, every closet, touching things, feeling surfaces that she knew better than anyone alive, seeing them differently now, not as tasks to be completed, but as spaces to be lived in. She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, the room that Victoria had occupied for 30 years, the room where Conchetta had changed the sheets every Monday and vacuumed the carpet every Wednesday and polished the furniture every Friday. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room, and she felt something that she hadn't expected. She felt nothing, no triumph, no revenge, no satisfaction, just emptiness. The room was just a room. The house was just a house, without the people in it, without the children's laughter and the smell of cooking and the sound of footsteps on the stairs. It was just walls and floors and windows. The house didn't matter. It had never mattered. What mattered was what happened inside it. The relationships, the love, the cruelty, the endurance. The 30 years of showing up every day and doing the work and loving the children and surviving the humiliation and saving $1 at a time toward a future that nobody believed was possible. That was what mattered, and that couldn't be bought at auction. The news spread through Greenwich like wildfire. The Sinclair Maid bought the Sinclair mansion. It was the kind of story that people couldn't stop telling because it contained everything that a good story needs: irony, justice, the reversal of power, the quiet victory of the underdog. The neighbors had opinions. Of course they did. Greenwich, Connecticut is not a town that handles disruption well. The old families, the ones whose names were on buildings and park benches and hospital wings, viewed the sale with the kind of polite horror that passes for outrage among the wealthy. At the country club, at the tennis courts, at the private school fundraisers, the same conversation played out dozens of times. Can you believe it? The maid. Their maid. She bought the house. How is that even possible? Some of them were genuinely disgusted, not because Conchetta had done anything wrong, but because her success exposed something they didn't want to examine. If the maid could buy the mansion, what did that say about the people who had lived in it? What did it say about a system that measured human beings by their addresses and their last names and the thread count of their sheets? What did it say about them? Others were quietly impressed. Helen Marsh, the woman from the garden party, the one who had told Conchetta her shoes were fine, was the first neighbor to knock on the door after Conchetta moved in. She brought a bottle of wine and a casserole and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. It's about time someone worth knowing lived in this house." The media picked it up. Local news first, then national. A reporter from the Hartford Courant called, then the New York Times, then CNN. Everyone wanted to interview the maid who bought the mansion. Everyone wanted the Cinderella story, the rags to riches narrative, the heartwarming tale of the humble servant who triumphed over her cruel mistress. Conchetta said no to all of them. She didn't want to be a story. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want the world's attention or the world's applause or the world's opinion about what her life meant. She knew what her life meant. She didn't need a television camera to validate it. But there was one conversation she couldn't avoid. Victoria called her 3 weeks after the sale. Conchetta was in the garden pruning the roses that she had maintained for 30 years when her phone rang. She looked at the number. She knew it. She had called it hundreds of times over the decades to confirm schedules and grocery lists and the details of dinner parties. She answered, "Hello, Mrs. Sinclair." The silence on the other end lasted 5 full seconds. "Is it true?" Victoria's voice was thin, strained, the voice of a woman who has been stripped of everything that made her feel powerful. "Is what true? Did you buy my house?" Conchetta set down the pruning shears. She wiped her hands on her apron, the same apron she had worn for 30 years, with the same faded floral pattern and the same stain on the front pocket from the time Elizabeth spilled grape juice on her when she was 4. "It's not your house anymore, Mrs. Sinclair. It's mine." Another silence. Longer this time. "How? How could you possibly afford?" "I saved every week for 30 years. While you were spending, I was saving. While you were buying things you didn't need, I was putting money away. While you were living a life you couldn't afford, I was building one I could." Victoria didn't respond. "I want you to know something," Conchetta continued. "I didn't buy this house to hurt you. I didn't buy it for revenge. I didn't buy it to prove a point. I bought it because your children asked me to, because Charlotte and James and Elizabeth wanted this house to stay in the family. And whether you like it or not, Mrs. Sinclair, I am family. I have been family for 30 years. I raised your children. I held them when they cried. I taught them to tie their shoes and pack their lunches and be kind to people, which is something they did not learn from you." She took a breath. "I bought this house because it's the only home your children have ever known, and I'm going to take care of it the way I've always taken care of it. The only difference is that now I walk through the front door." Victoria hung up without saying another word. Conchetta stood in the garden holding her phone, looking at the roses. They were in full bloom, red and pink and white. The same roses she had tended for 3 decades. The same roses that Victoria had never once complimented. The same roses that Conchetta had talked to and pruned and fed and loved in the same quiet, stubborn way. She did everything. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to pruning. The children came home for Christmas that year. All 3 of them. Charlotte drove up from Manhattan with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter. James flew in from Portland with his partner in a camera bag full of equipment because he wanted to photograph the house in its new era, as he put it. Elizabeth took the train from Boston, still in her hospital scrubs, because she had come straight from a 36-hour shift and hadn't had time to change. They walked through the front door together, the same front door that their mother had told Conchetta never to use. They walked through the foyer and the hallway and into the kitchen, where Conchetta was standing at the stove, cooking the Christmas dinner she had cooked every year for 3 decades. The same recipes from her grandmother's cookbook, the ones the children had grown up on, the ones that tasted like childhood and safety and love. The smell hit them first. Garlic and rosemary and tomatoes and the warm, yeasty scent of bread baking in the oven. It was the smell of every Christmas they had ever known. The smell that had always meant Conchetta was here. The smell that meant they were safe. Charlotte hugged her first. She buried her face in Conchetta's shoulder and held on like a child, like the 3-year-old girl who used to follow her around the house asking questions about Italy. Then James, who wrapped his long arms around both of them and pressed his forehead against Conchetta's hair. Then Elizabeth, who was so tired from her 36-hour shift that she could barely stand, but who somehow found the energy to squeeze tighter than anyone. They stood in the kitchen, all 4 of them holding each other, and they cried. Not because they were sad, because they were home. For the first time in their lives, they were truly home. Not in the house, in the arms of the person who had made it a home. Charlotte's daughter, Sophia, named after Conchetta's suggestion and over Victoria's objection, took her first steps that Christmas. She let go of the coffee table in the library and walked 4 unsteady steps across the carpet and fell into Conchetta's arms. Everyone cheered. James got it on camera. Elizabeth, who had delivered hundreds of babies but had never seen her own niece walk, burst into tears for the third time that day. They ate dinner in the dining room, at the big table, the one that seated 24. Concetta sat at the head, in the chair that Victoria had always occupied. Charlotte sat on her right, James on her left, Elizabeth next to James, Sophia in a high chair between Charlotte and her husband, and the table that had hosted decades of stiff, formal dinners where children were seen and not heard, and the maid ate in the kitchen was now covered in pasta sauce stains and breadcrumbs, and spilled wine, and the beautiful, chaotic mess of a family actually enjoying each other's company. After dinner, James set up his record player in the living room and put on Dean Martin. Concetta danced with Charlotte's husband, who was a terrible dancer, but an enthusiastic one. Elizabeth danced with James, stepping on his feet every 4 beats. Charlotte sat on the couch with Sophia in her lap and watched and laughed until her sides ached. It was the best Christmas any of them had ever had, not because of the house, not because of the food, because the invisible wall was gone. The wall between the service door and the front door. The wall between the kitchen chair and the dining room table. The wall between the help and the family. It was gone, demolished, not by money or revenge or the dramatic reversal of fortune, by love. By 30 years of quiet, stubborn, undefeatable love, Concetta had done something with the house that Victoria never had. She had made it warm. She had opened the curtains and let the light in. She had put flowers in every room, from the garden, not from a florist. She had hung the children's artwork on the walls, the drawings and the paintings and the photographs that Victoria had kept in a storage closet because they didn't match the decor. She had put family photos on every surface, not the staged professional portraits that Victoria had commissioned, but the real ones, the blurry ones, the ones where someone was mid-laugh or making a face or caught off guard, the ones that showed what life actually looked like when it wasn't being curated. The house felt different. It smelled different. It sounded different. The silence that had once been heavy and oppressive was now light and easy, the silence of a house that is at peace with itself. James took photographs all weekend. He captured the light in the library, the roses in the garden, Concetta's hands flour-dusted rolling pasta dough on the kitchen counter, Charlotte's daughter taking her first steps in the hallway, Elizabeth asleep on the couch, still in her scrubs, with a blanket that Concetta had tucked around her. He published the photographs 6 months later in a gallery show in Portland called Home. It was the most successful exhibition of his career. Critics called it a meditation on belonging and the true meaning of family. One review said it was the most honest depiction of the American dream he had ever seen because it showed the dream belonging to the person who actually earned it. Concetta didn't go to the exhibition. She doesn't like to fly, and Portland is a long way from Greenwich, but James sent her a frame print of his favorite photograph from the series. It showed the kitchen of the Sinclair estate, now the Ferraro estate, bathed in warm morning light. On the counter, there was a bowl of flour, a rolling pin, and a grandmother's cookbook open to a recipe for pasta alla norma. And in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, was a woman's hand reaching for a jar of tomatoes on the top shelf. Concetta hung the photograph in the kitchen, right above the counter where Victoria used to leave the $200 Christmas bonus. Richard Jr. died 2 years after the bankruptcy. Heart attack, alone, in the small apartment he had rented in Stamford after Victoria left him. He had been divorced for 6 months. His children attended the funeral. His ex-wife did not. He was 59 years old. He had spent the last 2 years of his life in a studio apartment that was smaller than the master bathroom of the house he grew up in. He worked part-time at a real estate office, not as a developer or an investor, but as a clerk, filing paperwork and answering phones for $8 an hour above minimum wage. He didn't complain. Charlotte said he seemed almost relieved, as if the loss of the fortune had freed him from a role he never wanted to play. He had been sober for the last year of his life. He attended meetings. He read books. He took long walks along the waterfront in Stamford and watched the boats in the harbor and thought about things he had never had time to think about when he was rich and busy and drowning in a life that was too big for him. He called Concetta once about 3 months before he died. It was a short conversation. He told her he was proud of what she had done with the house. He told her the garden looked better than it ever had. He told her he was sorry, not for any specific thing, for all of it. For the 30 years of watching his wife treat her like furniture and not doing enough to stop it. for the envelope under the kitchen door, which he now realized was a gesture that acknowledged the problem without solving it, for being a man who meant well but lacked the courage to act on his convictions. Concetta listened, and when he was done, she said, "You were kind to me, Mr. Sinclair. That counted for more than you know." He thanked her. His voice broke when he said it, and that was the last time they spoke. Concetta attended the funeral. She wore black and stood in the back and said a prayer for the man who had slipped an envelope under the kitchen door 30 years ago, the man who said good morning, the man who said thank you, the man who had been trapped in a life that was too big for him and had never found his way out. After the funeral, Charlotte found Concetta in the parking lot. "He always said you were the best person in that house," Charlotte said. Concetta nodded. "He was a good man, just a lost one. Aren't we all?" Concetta looked at her. This girl she had taught to tie her shoes, this woman who now argued cases in federal court and drove a BMW and had a closet full of suits that cost more than Concetta had ever spent on herself. This person who was, in every way that mattered, her daughter. "Not all of us," Concetta said. "Some of us know exactly where we are." Victoria Sinclair lived out her years in a modest condominium in Westport, supported by a small stipend from Charlotte, who felt obligated despite everything, and by the remnants of a trust fund that the bankruptcy lawyers hadn't been able to touch. She never visited the house again. She never called Concetta again. She never acknowledged publicly or privately that the woman who had cleaned her toilets for 30 years had outworked her, outsaved her, outlasted her, and ultimately replaced her in the one role that mattered most, the role of the person the children came home to. Concetta Maria Ferraro lived in the house on the hill in Greenwich, Connecticut, for the rest of her life. She maintained the garden. She cooked from her grandmother's cookbook. She opened the front door to her children and their children and their children's children, and she filled that house with the kind of warmth that money cannot buy, and cruelty cannot destroy, and time cannot erode. She made changes to the house, not dramatic ones, not renovations or remodels or the kind of expensive updates that interior designers charge a fortune for. Small changes, human changes. She replaced the formal dining room curtains with lighter ones that let the sun in. She put a rocking chair on the front porch because she had always wanted a front porch with a rocking chair, and now she had one. She filled the library with books she actually wanted to read. Novels in Italian and English, poetry collections, cookbooks, travel guides for places she dreamed of visiting. She turned the smallest guest bedroom into a sewing room where she made dresses for Sophia and quilts for the other grandchildren and alterations for neighbors who had heard about the Italian woman on the hill who could fix anything with a needle and thread. The room smelled like fabric and steam and the lavender sachets she kept in the drawers, and it became her favorite room in the house. Not the library, not the master bedroom, the sewing room, because it was the room where she created things, where her hands were busy and her mind was quiet, and the hours passed without wait. She became part of the community in a way the Sinclairs never had. She brought food to neighbors when they were sick. She hosted a weekly Italian cooking class in her kitchen for anyone who wanted to learn. She let the local garden club use her grounds for their annual tour. She volunteered at the elementary school, helping children with their reading, sitting in small chairs at small tables with the same patience she had shown Charlotte and James and Elizabeth 30 years before. People in Greenwich called her Mrs. Ferraro. They said her name correctly, every syllable, Concetta. They said it with respect and warmth, and the kind of recognition that comes not from money or status, but from the simple fact of being a good neighbor and a kind person. She never hired a housekeeper. She cleaned the house herself, every room, every floor, every window, not because she couldn't afford to hire someone, because the cleaning was part of who she was. It was not a punishment. It was not a burden. It was the work she had done her whole life, and she had always done it with pride, and she was not going to stop now just because the house had her name on the deed instead of someone else's. But she did make one change to her routine, one small, deliberate, symbolic change that meant more to her than the deed or the keys or the title. She stopped using the service door. For 30 years, she had entered that house through the side, through the narrow, unmarked door that was hidden behind a hedge and led directly to the kitchen, the door for deliveries and contractors and the help, the door that said without words, "You are not welcome in the main part of this house. You are a function. Enter accordingly. She had that door removed, not boarded up, not locked, removed. She hired a contractor to take it out entirely and replace it with a window, a beautiful window, with a stained glass panel that James had designed for her, showing a garden in bloom with a woman kneeling among the flowers. Light poured through it every morning, painting the kitchen wall in colors that hadn't existed in that room before. Where there had been a door that excluded, there was now a window that illuminated. Charlotte brought her children to the house every holiday. James came twice a year with new photographs and stories from Portland. Elizabeth came whenever her schedule allowed, which was more often than anyone expected, because she had learned from Conchetta that showing up is the most important thing you can do. Sophia grew up running through those hallways the way Charlotte had once run through them. She climbed the same trees in the garden. She sat at the same kitchen counter and watched Conchetta roll pasta dough and asked questions about Italy and food and why the sky was blue. The cycle continued. The love continued. The house, which had once been a monument to wealth and status, and the careful maintenance of appearances, became what it was always meant to be, a home, not a statement, not a symbol, not a 12,000 square foot argument for the supremacy of the Sinclair name. A home, 4 walls and a roof and a garden and a kitchen where someone was always cooking, and a front door that was always open, and the smell of garlic and rosemary drifting through rooms that had finally learned what warmth felt like. Conchetta walked through the front door every morning. She stood in the foyer with the marble floors and the high ceilings and the light that poured in through the tall windows. And she said the same thing every time, quietly, to herself, in Italian. Buongiorno, casa mia. Good morning, my house. Not because it was a mansion, not because it was worth millions, not because it represented the defeat of the woman who had humiliated her, because it was hers, earned, paid for, bought with 30 years of patience and dignity, and the kind of stubborn, unbreakable determination that the world calls poor and God calls rich. Because the woman who enters through the service door and the woman who enters through the front door were always the same woman. The only thing that changed was the door. Buongiorno, casa mia, every morning for the rest of her life, and the front door was always open.